bumps a dime in your prime.
It was one of the most iconic moments in 1960s music. The night Bob Dylan came on stage at the Newport Folk Festival and played an electric set, to the consternation and anger of his audience.
Oh, the time will come up when the wind...
It was a far cry from the folk roots from which he had emerged, championed by the likes of Pete Seeger and Joan Baez. It is now the dramatic high point of a new movie about Dylan's early years, from director James Mangold and starring Timothée Chalamet. Timothée Chalamet and James Mangold, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
The dramatic climax of the film is Bob Dylan's decision to play an electric set at Newport. Why do you believe that was such a significant moment?
Well, I believe it was a significant moment in retrospect. People look back afterward and identify how much the early 60s changed. You know, how the late 60s are very different, more raucous, unruly, rock and roll, Woodstock, Vietnam, RFK's assassination, the ever-increasing fear of nuclear mutual destruction. That was all really the late 60s, and the early 60s were a harbinger of it. And I can see people identifying this concert as a kind of turning point.
They were momentous times in the world, but you can only imagine what a strange time it must have been for a young musician who was still only 24 in 1965. Trying to break into the human story and the musician's story was part of director James Mangold's ambition with the movie.
200 people in that room, and each one wants me to be somebody else.
We have to make a human moment happen that may have historical ramifications, but none of the characters are aware in that moment they're making history. And that for me, it was much more important to get the feeling that Bob had to push away the confinements that he had been feeling and embrace, you know, he had always wanted to play rock and roll since he was 13.
How does it feel?
Bob Dylan has been universally famous for as long as many of us have been alive, and universally famous just as television took the experience to a whole new level. But it was a different sort of fame to that experienced by the Beatles. The lyricism and power of Dylan's poetry galvanised young people. It was political. People saw significance in his every gesture, like this man.
I'd like to know about the meaning of the photograph with you and the wearing the Triumph t-shirt.
What did you want to know about it?
Well, I'd like to know that that's an equivalent photograph. It means something. It's got a philosophy in it. And I'd like to know visually what it represents to you, because you're a part of that.
I haven't really looked at it that much.
I've thought about it a great deal.
Fame is still a wild phenomenon to negotiate. The young star of the movie, Timothée Chalamet, confronts it himself. Bob Dylan has found his own ways of coping with the immensity of his fame over the years. But a fascinating aspect of this new movie is that it portrays him as something of an invention from the moment he first arrives in New York.
You never talk about your family, your past.
People make up their past, Sylvie. They remember what they want. They forget the rest.
Timothy, your character says people make up their past, and even when we first see him arrive in New York, he tells people this implausible story about how he used to work in a carnival. Did he feel elusive to you when you were trying to work out how you would play this character?
Well, as you so wonderfully put it, this is the interpretation of Bob Dylan. You know, the real man is alive and well in Malibu, California, so he could give you a better answer than I could. James Mangold put together a script that sort of is unconventional in that it's about a young man, a young artist whose career takes off quite quickly, who's quite gifted from the jump, and is absent to sort of tropes or realities of more classic biopics or classic stories of young struggle.
There's a certain life of Brian madness to Bob Dylan's life in those early years. It's not just screaming girls. People actually thought he was the Messiah. Do you think the character you portrayed in the film reflected that madness, or was it that that was what he always was?
Well, it's probably a little bit of each. You know, we're not the man, so we're only left to make artistic conjecture. It seems to me that it is very possible that a young artist can be completely prepared to deliver gobsmackingly poetic art to a public, but not necessarily be ready for the gigantically adoring response to that art. That those are two entirely different psychological profiles. The ability to handle people considering you a prophet or a messiah or just a superstar or just adoring you, and the very private, personal, meditative, Zen-like act of making art.
I think Jim does that primarily through the eyes of other characters. The wonderful Elle Fanning, who plays Sylvia Russo, Boyd Holbrook, who does a wonderful job playing Johnny Cash, Edward Norton, Pete Seeger, Monica Barbaro, who plays Joan Baez. Just fantastic, you know. So I think the key to what you're describing is really seeing how Bob Dylan affects those around him in the film, the character of Bob Dylan, and seeing how what their impact is on him.
Your songs are like an oil painting at the dentist's office.
You're kind of an asshole, Bob.
Well, talking about the way the other characters saw Bob Dylan, Joan Baez certainly has a frank assessment of Bob Dylan during the film. What do you think the other characters do tell us about the Bob Dylan that you're creating in the movie?
Well, I think they tell us many things. A movie isn't static, and a role isn't static. It's actually a temporal art form. So you're moving moment to moment through different feelings. One can be in love with someone and fascinated and even charmed by someone and think they're a bit of an asshole. These things can all be true. And that gives Monica in that moment a chance to play many colors, to be, you know, to be fascinated by his blunt, even cruelty, but at the same time to be completely charmed by it because she lives in a world of bullshit and endless praise. Too often when we talk about movies in print or even among ourselves, we talk about them as static things. But the characters are one thing in the first 10 minutes and another in the middle hour and another thing in the end, and that's true for all of them if they're alive and in the movie. And so it becomes hard because, you know, as Bob says, I contain multitudes.
He certainly does, and so does the movie. Thank you so much to both of you for talking to us tonight.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.